Okay, are we good to start now? Perfect. Okay. Well, hello everyone. I'm very excited to present to you for a kind of lecture that I'm calling the Naturalist Notebook. So as I kind of mentioned, my background is in art. So I've been making art for a very long time, and art history as well. So we are going to kind of begin with a historical look at how naturalists have used journaling to kind of inform their practice. So there's going to be a lot of history and art history here. And then we're going to kind of end with some ways that you can kickstart your own journaling practice, because I know people are often intimidated by art. And so I want it to not be intimidating. I want it to be approachable. Kind of first and foremost, what does journaling mean? To me, it's any way of recording your observations about the natural world. And I will, as you'll see throughout this presentation, I have a really fluid understanding of that. Again, I studied sculpture, so to me, even making something three-dimensionally is a sketch. So to me, that can include writings, sketches, watercolor, pressed plants, paintings, photography, recipes, much, much more. All of that can be part of your nature journaling. Why would you want to keep, why would a naturalist keep a journal? So historically, which we're gonna kind of go through, it was really used to bring information about foreign species to the masses, things that were, knowledge that wasn't available to everyone, through notebooks, through observations, through writings were made available to the public at large. Recording your observations helps you to learn more about whatever you're studying, kind of lets the information sink back in, lets you reflect on it. And as long as you are able to reflect on your journal entries year over year, a lot of times that helps you to notice patterns and changes. To me, it's very fun and rewarding. And the millennial in me will use the word mindfulness. I don't know if other generations use that, but really it's a time to be present in the moment and have some self-care. So we're going to begin with a history of naturalist notebooks, going back to the 1600s to the present. And the first person I'd like to look at is a name that might be familiar to some of you. This is Robert Hooke. Can we mute Sharon? I think that's, sorry, I'm hearing her over me. So Robert Hooke, like many of the folks that we're gonna kind of look at today, he was a polymath. And this is kind of funny that we were kind of having a conversation earlier about many of us having lots of different interests. That's really what a polymath is. It's someone who is kind of jack of all trades, but master of many as well. So they're very highly skilled in lots of different areas. This is not an official portrait. We don't have any official portrait of Robert Hooke, but this is what we think he looks like. He was English, and from a very young age, his father noted that he really had a talent for art and for making mechanical instruments. So his father thought that he was going to be an artist, and he did study as an artist apprentice for some time, but ultimately he graduated from Oxford, and he became an assistant to Robert Boyle, which, if you know Boyle's law, this is one of the founders of modern chemistry. So he was really very well connected in the scientific field. And so Robert Boyle, in 1660, he founded the Royal Society of London, which was an organization to advance scientific understanding of the world. And 2 years later, he brought Hooke on as the curator of experiments, which was a title that he held for 40 years. And so I say all this to kind of really bring their motto into play, which was nullus in verba, which means take nobody's word for it, which I think was awesome because it was really, the society wanted to focus on learning about the world through experimentation rather than through philosophy, which we're going to see that theme like really present a lot, is folks starting to kind of reject historical philosophical leanings in favor of direct observation. So as I said, he was very skilled at building his own instruments. So this is a compound microscope that he designed and built, and this is also his illustration of it as well. So microscopes had existed for some time, but in 1590, the first compound microscope was designed by a glasses maker. And Hooke really begins to utilize this 70 years later. So really, it wasn't utilized by scientists for some time, for his book, Micrographia, which was put out in 1665. I don't know if this is a book that you guys have seen, but we're going to see some images from it. It's a really amazing read. This is an excerpt from Robert Hooke's diary. So it was kind of cool just to see the way his mechanical illustrations were very fluid with his writings. I know this is kind of illegible. Some stuff just doesn't survive and isn't legible, but it's still a nice little peek into his mind. He was one of the first people to observe snow under a microscope. So really, we didn't know what snow looked like. This illustration in the top right corner is just a basic ink wash that he brought to the Royal Society. And that ended up informing some of his illustrations that were in his book, which this image on the right was from that book, Micrographia, in 1665. So we have images of snowflakes and crystals under a microscope. So really the first time that common artifacts like the snowflake are seen at this level. Now, what was really groundbreaking was this illustration of a flea, which is probably the most famous image from Micrographia. This book really was one of the most important scientific books ever written. It was a bestseller at its time, but it was met with a lot of criticism. And looking at an image like this, you can kind of begin to understand that, because it's almost terrifying, right? It's an alien-looking creature. This is not what we understand a flea to look like. So it really kind of shook people to their core. But the importance of this book can't be understated, because really it kind of paved the way for microbiology, quantum physics, nanotechnology. This is what scientists were inspired to follow after seeing Hooke's work that he had done here. This is another image from Micrographia, which was him observing cork plant cells under a microscope. And this is the first time that a cell is observed. So a cell is our basic building block of life. And he named it. He didn't really understand its true biological function at this point. He just observed it. But he named it because if we look at the left part of the circular image here, it to him looked like the individual rooms in a monastery, which were known as cells. So that's how cells get their name. It's just, to him, that's what it looked like under a microscope. And that quote up there is just him acknowledging that this had never been seen before. He was also really fascinated by fossils. And so this is an illustration that was published after his death, where he was really beginning to start to compare fossils with living organisms. And he was recognizing that some species had lived and had gone extinct. And this was brand new information. People really still at this point believe that species could not go extinct. They've really thought that most stuff was there for the purpose of serving man. And so really this is hinting at evolution 2.5 centuries before Darwin. So really groundbreaking stuff happening here. He probably didn't even fully understand what he was seeing. But he was able to start to draw some conclusions that if we had fossils of things that did not have living equivalents, then he concluded that some species no longer existed. And then if that's true, he concluded that some species that are alive today did not exist in the past. So again, we're starting to just very lightly touch the surface of understanding evolution pretty early on here. This is a quote. So I got a copy of Micrographia from the library. Our libraries are amazing. I got this really beautiful book and just happened upon this quote that I loved, which I thought embodied a lot of what the theme of a lot of these naturalists' observations were. The truth is, the science of nature has been already too long made only a work of the brain and the fancy. It is now high time that it should return to the plainness and soundness of observations on material and obvious things. It is said of great empires that the best way to preserve them from decay is to bring them back to the first principles and arts on which they did begin. So again, that theme of really starting to not focus your education on the philosophical writings of people like Aristotle, but getting back to direct observation. And that leads us really nicely into Maria Sibylla Merian. She was a German artist and naturalist. She collected and studied insects from a very early age. At age 13, she was already raising silkworms. So she was fascinated by metamorphosis, and really she carved the path for us to understand metamorphosis. I want to give you a little bit of historical context here to, again, understand the ideas that they were up against. So this is an example of what's called a Wunderkammer, or a curio cabinet, or cabinet of curiosities. So this is prior to museums. We had these curio cabinets, there's no other word for them, where folks displayed a mishmash of artifacts. So this could be bones, teeth, taxidermied specimens, drawings. There was often not any sort of label attached to anything. They were not arranged by any order. It was really just a place of what they considered to be curious artifacts of nature. There was lots of folks who had personal collections. These were really a symbol of class and status. And that's because this was the age of discovery, particularly in natural sciences. So this is an example of a personal collection here. Another thing that's important for us to understand about this time is the belief in spontaneous generation was still really prevalent. So science was really young. Again, we're struggling at this point to balance the scientific method against the belief in magic, and that against creation as described in Genesis. So we're kind of struggling to understand science against God and against magic. Aristotle really talked about spontaneous generation, so this belief was passed down for some time. Galileo started kind of challenging that. He's quoted of saying, "I think that in the discussion of natural problems, we ought not to begin at the authority of places of scripture, but at sensible experiments and necessary demonstrations." And Galileo, of course, was prosecuted for proclaiming the earth revolved around the sun. So there's just so much information here that people are receiving before they're ready to hear it and understand it. So to get back to spontaneous generation, this is the idea that snow gave birth to flies, or that raindrops yielded frogs. We couldn't see what was happening. We couldn't see eggs being laid. So we really start to kind of draw silly conclusions. And there was folks that actually had recipes out there. So a recipe for creating flies was, crush fly cadavers and sprinkle them with honey water. You'll find all these really silly kind of recipes throughout history. So that's just a little bit of historical context to get us into Maria Sibylla Merian. So Merian really was all about investigating animals in their natural habitat. She observed the plants that they fed on. She charted the stages of their development. This was one of her very early drawings. And it's honestly, you're gonna see how much she changes. I included it just to see how much she develops, because this is kind of a romantic view of nature. It's out of context. We don't have any insects. It's a very idyllic version of this plant. And a lot of the artists at the time were not observing directly from nature. Those curio cabinets that we talked about, the specimens that were collected, artists were drawing from specimens. They were not going out and collecting their own things. She was kind of sick of that, so she focused on direct observation, field work, really recognizing the entire life cycle and the interrelationships between plants and animals. And this really kind of lays the groundwork for modern day ecology. This is, again, a pretty early work of hers from her book, Neues Blumenbuch, which is a book of new flowers. And we start to see that she's introducing animal species on the plant. We're starting to see a relation. They're not isolated from each other. But she really makes quite a big leap after her visit to Suriname. So in 1699, at age 52 years old, she travels with her daughter to South America from Amsterdam on an exhibition solely to study metamorphosis. This was unheard of at this time for any naturalist to make a trip of this sort. Typically, folks were traveling to this region for political, economic, or military reasons. This was a century before Darwin or Humboldt would make similar trips to study in South America. And she funded this herself by selling years of paintings. Her research from this trip was published in her book, Metamorphosis Insectorium Surinamensium. And this is where we start to notice a change in her style. We can see that we have all the stages of development here of the emperor moth are represented on a host plant. We can see the plant is no longer kind of idealized. There's holes chewed through the leaves. We can see how the species is interacting with it. Very different than that first drawing of a rose that we had there. This is, she was not just focused on plants, she was interested in metamorphosis at large, I guess, or yeah, the evolution of species at large. So this is her illustration of a Surinamese toad. So in observing amphibian life cycles, she was trying to dispel that belief in spontaneous generation. That's what all of this is. She's really interested in showing metamorphosis and dispelling spontaneous generation. So this is her documenting the life cycle of the Surinamese toad, which we can see it's carrying the eggs on its back. So it's not coming from nowhere. It's not springing from mud. It's coming from its own species. And then it gets pretty gnarly here too with another plate from Metamorphosis, which I really love, which shows this guava tree that's like just been decimated. Like there's hardly any leaves there because we have all the leaf cutter and army ants just chewing it to death. We have a tarantula here on the bottom left corner that's eating a hummingbird. I mean, this is like nature fighting for its life, which again, very different than the ideas that were out there. This is no Garden of Eden. This is again 150 years before Darwin writes about the origin of species and is writing about nature and its constant struggle for survival. And I included this plate here of a snake just because I love it. I think it's so beautiful. But I just wanted to end talking about kind of her legacy. So she was one of the first people to study the rainforest. Linnaeus, in compiling his systemization of natural life, used her drawings rather than actual specimen to help classify species. So she wasn't interested in classification, she was just interested in metamorphosis. So she was using species that had not yet been named. Most of her accomplishments were dismissed or forgotten because she was an amateur and because she was a woman. Folks feared that if they built upon her, they would be discredited. So she doesn't get a whole lot of historical credit. That's sort of changing now. And we would be remiss if we didn't talk about Alexander von Humboldt. Humboldt was a Prussian, another polymath. I mean, really, this man was amazing. His interests spanned astronomy, botany, chemistry, economics, geography, geology, physics, politics, and zoology. Really, he was, again, one of those jack of all trades, master of many. And we're going to talk mostly about his travels in the Americas and the incredible research and discovery he made during this time. His research is very well documented. So all of his diaries survive. So you can see these are all of his notebooks from his travels over his 5 years through America. And many of these have been scanned and are available to the public. So during his quest through the South America, he mapped rivers, he collected plant samples, he studied rocks as he was a trained mining inspector and geologist. And then these are just a couple of sketches that are pulled from his diary. So I really love these kind of rough drafts of seeing the mind at work, seeing the personal notes that he's making along with his illustrations. Got a couple more here. He actually, while in South America, he experimented with live electric eels a lot. Even on himself, he tested electricity on human muscle. So this is an illustration of that. So a very, very curious mind that would really stop at nothing. This is another great illustration from his diary that leads us into some of his finished work, because he was really a visual thinker. He made so many great scientific recordings and observations, but he was fantastic at translating all that scientific information into a visual representation that people could understand. He took a barometer with him everywhere. He recorded everything. And what he's probably most known for is this illustration here, which is called the Naturgemälde, which really means, our rough translation would be a painting of nature. And so this illustration is based on his experience. He and his team climbed a 19,000-foot climb up to Mount Chimborazo in Ecuador. He got very sick from this journey, but he took so many measurements. He took altitude, air temperature, barometric pressure at various locations, and he took very extensive notes on the locations of plants and animals. So this cross section we can see here in white on the mountain, that's him noting different plant and animal species at different levels of elevation. So this is just a visualization of his notes. And to the left and right, what we have are just several columns that provide kind of more details. It has temperature, gravity, humidity, blueness of the sky, everything, again, that's related to the height of the mountain. This is really important because most scientists who were looking at things like climate then were just looking at weather. But Humboldt really is starting to see the interconnection of land mass, of altitude, of weather, of oceans. He's beginning to understand really how humans can induce climate change, and was so successful at turning this into an infographic. And some of the research that he did back here in 1802, we've been able to go back, which you can see this kind of modern day here thing at 2012, and observe how plants have started migrating upwards as the temperature has risen. So we've been able to use his research and his illustrations to further kind of scientific knowledge. Another great contribution that he made were, he really developed isotherm lines. So previously, it was just thought that weather was based solely on latitude rather than recognizing kind of the ebb and flow here. He also recognized that Africa and South America may have once been joined. He was the first one to do this. One thing that I learned about him too, which is not represented here, is in his trip in South America, he spent time at Lake Valencia, and after talking to locals and observing the land, he saw islands where lakes had once been, right next to forests that were cleared. He observed that there were shells and sand in the soil, and he began to understand that deforestation was a cause of the loss of water there. And so again, this is laying the groundwork for conservation in the future. This was a new idea that was, again, earth-shattering to people. He also was wonderful at acknowledging what a keystone species was. So if you don't really remember this terminology, it's sort of this species that's essential for an ecosystem. And he recognized that, oh, I don't know how to pronounce this, but it's Maroticia fruits, maybe the Maroticia palm. It attracted birds, it shielded the wind, it held the soil in place, it sheltered insects and worms. It's one of those plants that was just critical for an ecosystem. Again, a very new idea that was documented through his writings and through his art. This is an interesting kind of graphic. The person who wrote Alexander von Humboldt's recent biography, which you might have heard of, The Invention of Nature, she also worked with an illustrator to make a graphic novel. So this is just a screenshot from that graphic novel. And what's really cool about the graphic novel is they take hundreds of images from his diary and his illustrations, and they mix it in with some new illustrations. So we have his drawings and diary images mixed in there. But to kind of talk about the end of his trip in South America, he does visit North America. He does come to America. He actually meets with, at the time, President Thomas Jefferson, as well as a lot of other influential figures. And he really lays the groundwork for helping to shape our views of an emerging America and linking our national identity to nature. So the establishment of national parks and national monuments as kind of embodying the American spirit, he really lays the groundwork here. He plants the seed in the minds of these folks. It was so wonderful that we kind of began our conversation tonight talking about, I know everyone was talking about bird watching, so I'm excited that we have John James Audubon in here, because what an important attribution to birds he is. Whoops, I skipped ahead too fast. John James Audubon, he was born as Jean-Jacques Rabin, actually, in what is now Haiti. So it's a French colony, Saint Dominique. There was a lot of turmoil and unrest in that region, so he came to the US at age 18 and settled near Philadelphia. His father owned a mining company at Mill Grove. So when he landed in America, he begins to really form his love of nature. He studies taxidermy, and he uses this skill to illustrate birds. So really having those taxidermied species helps him to be able to illustrate these birds. These are some of his early sketches in his sketchbooks. And I included both of these because these are both, as you may recognize, species that are now extinct, the passenger pigeon and the Carolina parakeet. But what beautiful illustrations they are. So Audubon really, he hopped around a bit. He was in Kentucky, he was in Missouri, ultimately settled a little bit in New Orleans. And he taught drawing there, and he painted portraits on the street. And during this time, he amasses hundreds of his own drawings of birds. He tries to find a US publisher. He wants to make a book from all these, but to no avail. He actually ends up sailing to the UK. He exhibits his work there. They're captivated. This idea of the American frontier is so captivating to them. They're able to set the stage for him to produce his Birds of America book. So this is one of those beautiful plates from Birds of America. And this book, if you haven't seen it in person, I was lucky enough to get a copy from the library. It's just stunning. The digital images really don't compare to the images printed in a book. So if you can get your hands on a copy, please do. But this book was 435 hand-colored life-size prints of 497 bird species. And these are all made from engraved copper plates. And with copper plates, they put a film of wax on the front of it, and they etch it with acid. So we get all those kind of dark grooves from that. And then they often go back and hand color them. So it's a really ambitious project. To show how ambitious it is, the printing of this series would have costed $2 million today. And he paid for this from selling oil paintings, from advanced subscriptions, from exhibitions, selling those skins that he collected and hunted. There's one last one. I just pulled out a couple that I thought were they're really cool. They're just lovely. And in his work, he actually discovered 25 new species and 12 new subspecies. So not just an artist. He really made some pretty amazing discoveries. I'm not going to spend a lot of time touching on Charles Darwin because really his most famous journey to South America, the HMS Beagle in 1831, he was accompanied by landscape painter Conrad Martins, and Conrad Martins actually did most of the artwork from their travels. Darwin Darwin does sketch, but very minimally, and this is an example of one of those sketches from Conrad Martins' sketchbooks during their journey. He's a landscape painter, so you'll see a lot of really full, beautiful sketches from his notes. As I said, though, Darwin does keep sketchbooks. He does keep diaries, but they're very minimal. They're mostly writings. But one thing that's really cool here, these are a couple pages that I pulled where he's beginning to think about the tree as a metaphor for genealogical history. And he kind of begins by using coral as an example, but then lands on the tree. Another person we're going to kind of dip into a little bit here is Martha Maxwell. She's an artist, naturalist, and taxidermist from Pennsylvania. Again, like many folks, she got that early love of nature. She and her husband immigrated to Colorado during the gold rush. And while her husband mined, she tended a boarding house, and the boarding house actually burned down. And this was kind of a critical moment for her because her family was forced to move into this one-room cabin that she had also purchased, but there was a squatter in their cabin that they couldn't get out. And this is it's just like a fun origin story, because when she's trying to get this squatter out of her cabin, she discovers that he is a taxidermist, and she kind of falls in love with the art of taxidermy through the squatter. And I love this portrait of her, by the way, because she's got this artist palette in one hand, she's got her taxidermied species here, and she's got a rifle leaning against there because she was a hunter as well. So when she kind of develops this love of taxidermy, she actually has to go home to care for her family. And she studies taxidermy with her family in Wisconsin. She's there for 6 years. And then her husband asked her to return home. And this is where she begins focusing on her art. So very similar to Audubon, she uses the dead specimen for her artworks. Initially, she was recruiting neighborhood boys to hunt and bring her species. But then she kind of learns that she wants to have her own control. So she learns how to use a rifle and begins hunting in the Rockies. As she kind of grows in her taxidermy skills, she is invited by the Colorado Agricultural Society to do a display for them. And this is the beginning of the diorama. Martha Maxwell invents the diorama. So she, when creating her taxidermied species, she places them in more lifelike poses, and she creates habitats that surround them. Her Colorado exhibition is so successful that she actually opens her own museum, the Rocky Mountain Museum. So this image is a stereograph that would have been sold at that Rocky Mountain Museum. If you don't remember what a stereograph is, yeah, I see Chris is holding up the images. You find these at flea markets. It becomes a 3D image. That's why you'll see both of them here. And these are really some of the only photos available of her. So the next one is also a stereograph. As she grows in her taxidermy skills, she kind of begins developing her own processes. So rather than just stuffing and sewing skins together, she learns to work with a blacksmith and creates an iron frame for her taxidermied specimens. And she is eventually invited to the Centennial Exhibition of the United States in Philadelphia, and she has to represent the state of Colorado with the display. And they want her to be there as an interpreter. And this has been so fun to read about because she's a tiny little 5-foot woman. It would have been unheard of for women to be hunting, so they're all shocked, and they said, how could she do it? What did she wear to hunt in? And she's so frustrated by these questions that ultimately she makes this little placard that says women's work and places it in front of her exhibition. But her displays really kind of start to grow. She's got running water moving through them, and she also puts live prairie dogs in her displays. So I might have lost some of you here because you're like, what does this have to do with the sketchbook? But as I said, I'm a sculptor. So for me, this is sketching in 3 dimensions. Her legacy, she's the first woman field naturalist to obtain and prepare her own specimens. She also identified the Colorado screech owl, which is named after her. And really, this is, again, pre-museum. This is, she really set the standard for modern museum displays through her very natural habitats here. And so the last naturalist artist I have to cover before we kind of get into some methods of journaling, I'm trying to watch my time here too. Oh boy, it goes fast. Is Beatrix Potter, which you might know as the author of Peter Rabbit books. And you might really not know her as an artist and naturalist. She comes from an English, pretty wealthy family, as many Victorian women were. She was privately educated rather than going to university. Her parents are both very interested in the arts, so that feeds her love of art. But she's very interested in science. She loves archaeology, entomology, and mycology. So we're going to see that through her work. This is a sketch from her sketchbook that she did at 9 years old. So she has talent very early on. And this illustration, we don't see the other half of it, but she also starts pairing her drawings with observations on their habits. Her journals are also fascinating because she was a very diligent journal keeper. She kept a journal from age 14 to 30 that was filled with her sketches and her writings on society, observations on art and artists, stories from her life. But what was most fascinating is it's written in code. She develops her own code at age 14. A super fan actually, after studying her work for 13 years, deciphers her code, and eventually the translation was published. So you can get all of her journals. It was published in 1966. So really, really cool. This is, as she kind of develops, you can see the foundations laid from people like Hooke that were studying under a microscope. This is where we start to see where that comes into play for more contemporary artists and naturalists. They're observing nature at many different levels. So this is a sketch that she would have done of a ground beetle through many different levels of microscope. And then I noted that she was interested in mycology, so she was really intrigued by their reproduction. So she studies these independently at length, and she actually develops, she compiles her findings into a paper, which she submits to the Linnaean Society in London. But because she's an amateur, and probably also because she's a woman, her findings were debated and ultimately dismissed, even though she was right. She was pretty just ahead of her time. But this kind of slight was actually very important because it's probably what led her to focus more on her drawing and painting rather than her scientific research. This is just another illustration. She has lots of these mycological illustrations that are just really lovely. They're a mix of watercolor, and she also adds in white paint here and there with her watercolor to make it more opaque. She's known for these picture letters that she sends. And these picture letters really prove very critical. One letter that she sent to the son of her governess who was sick with scarlet fever, This is where she lays the foundation for the story of Peter Rabbit, and her governess suggested that she publish them. And so, yeah, you can see that she was just a person who was sketching and thinking in artistic ways all the time. So that was really the last historical person that I wanted to cover for y'all. And now we're going to kind of blast through, well, try not to go over time. And I would like to kind of just introduce you to some contemporary methods of journaling. Particularly, I wanted to focus on if you're a person who says like, oh, I can't even draw a stick figure. How am I supposed to journal? Which a lot of folks do whenever you tell them that you studied art. They'll say, oh, I can't even draw a stick figure. I wanted to not be scary. So we're going back to kind of like art camp methods. So first thing you can do to begin an art journal, hammering some plants can get some really lovely and beautiful results. In this image on the right here, these are both from an artist, Rebecca Desnos. She makes tutorials available. You can see she does it on paper, on fabric, on wood. And really, you would just lay like a paper towel on top of, or a piece of cotton fabric on top of whatever you're hammering, and just let the color bleed out onto that material as you're hammering it. So this can be like step one. I would like to add some color to my journal. Here we go. Another fantastic method is by pressing plants. Very, very easy and approachable. You don't need much. You can press them in a book, put it on your shelf for 2 weeks. There's fancy flower presses you can get too. I included this image because this person, this artist actually takes the paper that they're going to mount their pressed plants onto and dyes them with just like a black tea or a coffee to kind of get that vintage look. So it starts to look like some of those old sketchbook pages we saw. So it doesn't need to be difficult. Another process that I really love working with is cyanotypes, and this might have been something that you did at a camp early on, also known as sun printing. This is really a photographic process that's been around since 1842. And what's happening here is there's these chemicals that you brush onto paper or fabric or whatever you want to work with, let it dry, and you got to keep it in a dark room. And you don't have to have a fancy dark room. You can do this in your bathroom by putting a sheet over the window. Keep that paper in the dark. It's going to look green like that at the top. Lay some plants out on top of it. And if you don't want them to move, you can take like a piece of glass or a piece of plexi and put it on top. And you just let this sit in the sun. On a really sunny day, 5 minutes, you're going to get this beautiful blue that happens. But on a not so sunny day, it might take a little longer. It might take more like 10, 20, 30 minutes. But a really easy way to get really cool results in your journaling. Printmaking with plants is another really fun way to kind of get some interesting techniques incorporated into your journaling. In the top right, we can see you don't need fancy tools for this either. This person is just dabbing paint onto the veins of a specimen, and then they'll lay that upside down on a paper. And what I like to do is what's called burnishing with just a wooden spoon that you can grab from your kitchen. If you lay some paper over that, rub a wooden spoon over the top of it, it'll help transfer that. And I took printmaking classes in school. We used a wooden spoon even in our fancy classes. So that's no cheap cop out there. That's how they do it. This one on the bottom right, I really loved too, because she's doing what's called a resist. So if you want to kind of step it up and use proper equipment, that tool on the right is a brayer. So she's rolled a block printing ink onto a piece of glass or a piece of plexiglass with that brayer there on the right, created an even layer of color. You could then roll that brayer on top of plants, but what she's done instead is just rolled it onto the block, place the plant on top of that color, and then we get the negative of the image. So the color is actually, the color that's printed is what's around the plant rather than on top of the plant. These are easy ways to get cool looking results. Another printmaking method that's super duper easy is styrofoam printing. So you can take your takeout box or your meat trays or whatever, take a dull pencil, that's all you need, draw a little illustration on it, and then by rubbing ink on the top of that, and again, that wooden spoon technique, transferring it to a piece of paper, you're gonna get an inverse of what you drew. So everything that you pressed in is gonna show up as white. If you're not very confident in your drawing, this is a way to kind of take your drawing to the next level, because it's gonna, again, produce that inverse, which ends up looking pretty interesting. Watercolor is, of course, a great way to journal, but maybe can be more intimidating to some folks. The product that I linked down there at the bottom, it's a travel watercolor set that you can actually buy locally at St. Louis Art Supply. I have one myself. But what's really cool is that watercolor pen down there that's in that kit. You store water in the tube of it, and then it's got a brush at the end. So you don't need to make a mess. You can travel. This is a great way to do some field sketching. It's got a little foam pad there on the side for you to clean your brush off, and then a palette for mixing your colors. Very easy for on-the-go watercolor sketching. Sketching just with pencil, pen, colored pencils. This person here has a micron pen, which is kind of like a marker. It's like something in between a pen and a marker. You can get really cool results. And I love to mix watercolor with pen. If you let your watercolor dry and then go back and kind of draw on top of it, it's a great way to get the mixing of the fluidity of watercolor with some more detailed work. I'm a natural dyer, so I included this because I think it's a really cool way to connect with nature, and that you see what color plants can produce when you dye with them. So this bottom right here is how you might incorporate that into a sketchbook. These are lots of samples of little particles of the plant, as well as different swatches of fabric and how the color takes to different types of fabric. That one on the top right, that's actually my own, so I always document what material I'm dyeing with, if I did a modifier on it. Natural dyeing can get pretty complicated. It's pretty scientific, so if you want to start, I recommend black walnuts as a great way to start. If you just let them dry out in the sun for a week or two, and then toss them into a pot with some hot water, let them cook for 30 minutes or so. They don't need any pre-work to dye with, so it's a great place to start. Then I just wanted to show a couple of examples of some really cool nature journals. And what I like about these is whenever these artists are documenting their work, this person here is documenting the date. They've noted about the weather. They have this illustration at the bottom that shows kind of a full picture of the landscape. And then we kind of zoom in and we do lots of little details about the different specimens that they're observing, which I think is a really great way to journal. There's lots of information here. I love foraging. I love coming up with some fun recipes. So this person uses their nature journal to kind of come up with some recipes. And the illustrations there on the bottom, those are just like they cut out from an old book. So you could do collage too. I didn't even include collage as an example, but that's a nice way to journal too. Now this person here, Joe Brown, is a professional illustrator, but what I really loved about this one is that she kind of includes this magnified lens. So we get to see the whole plant with the animal or the species interacting with it, as well as the kind of zoomed in look of the details of that species. So that is all I have. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen, I guess. And I will be happy to answer any questions you guys might have.
That was awesome, Tara.
Oh my God,
Yeah.
so good.
Wow.
Thank you.
Yes, it was.
Really good.
I
Yeah, I
hope you
got-
guys learned some stuff.
I got a ton of
Absolutely.
questions here.
Man.
So I did get a big kick when you were talking about, well, actually it was, I think when you were talking about Audubon, when you were saying that it kind of hooked in with you, because earlier on you were saying that you have a tough time staying focused on anything. Yeah, he had a serious problem with focus, didn't he? And still excelled at all. But you know, with that, I get a kick too, because you know, you talk left brain, right brain things, and if you'd have seen my journaling back in the intern classes, you'd found out that I didn't do much in there because I don't draw well. I don't like drawing. You've given a whole lot of other options here, but you know, you've got scientific side of it, which would be very logical left brain type thing, and then you got the art side of it that was very right brain. Does that make it a very special person that can do that then?
That's a really great question, because I found myself going through art school. I'm only very, very slightly right brain dominant. You know, I've taken those tests. I do have a lot of logic behind my thinking. So that's a fair question, Bob, because I think I am kind of that person that kind of toes that line between the two. I hope not. I hope it's not just for a certain type of person. I think it's really fun to just play with materials and try stuff. And I don't know, I hope folks won't be intimidated, even with some of those really beginner methods. Cyanotypes is a great place to start. It's going to look cool no matter what.
No, the options you gave were pretty incredible. I took a bunch of those down. The hammering, the pressing, the cyanotypes, print make, and all those things. Those are obviously things that somebody like me that doesn't have the same artistic talent that other members of my family might have could still use those.
For sure.
I'm going to pause for somebody else can ask, but I got a whole bunch of others. So I'll jump in on the next one here. Because you had mentioned about, I think this was during the Alexander von Humboldt portion of it. You talked about he was early on in determination. This was in like 1802 of climate change. You kind of touched upon that a little bit because you were saying about when people were doing deforestation, how it was groundwater and things like that was impacted. But it's a little bit more of a jump to get to climate change on that. Did he
Yeah, I think just because he was so wonderful at using his barometer and using his tools to really track things at all levels. I mean, I think you're right. It was just the beginning of that, and he might have been informed. He might have been informed by some other writings that were kind of floating around at the time. But I think that's a fair observation, Bob. Is that it's really kind of not enough information, but he was just ahead of his time. So he might have just been speculating, which I think is a lot of the scientific method, is you have a hypothesis, you don't know if it's true, and maybe he didn't really get to test it, but used his observations to kind of make that jump. Oh, I saw Barb asked in the chat, who wrote the graphic novel about Humboldt? That's Andrea Wolf. I should type that in there too. And she actually wrote that New York Times biography, The Invention of Nature, which is the more traditional biography, but then she worked with an illustrator to make the graphic novel too. And it's beautiful, it's really stunning.
I missed your comment about Audubon, something being $2 million today. What was that?
Yeah, for him to produce his Birds of America book, that would have cost $2 million in today's dollars. I think at the time it was like something like $112,000, but what that translates today is $2 million.
And I can't read my own writing. I call her the Annie Oakley of the group.
Martha Maxwell.
Maxwell, okay, I could not read my own writing. Excellent presentation, thank you.
Thank you.
Very interesting.
Yeah, I really, I didn't know about a lot of these figures before I kind of began my research. I started with the list of who I thought I was going to study, and I had to knock off, 60% of them because I just didn't have the time. So I left out a lot of really important people. John Muir, Ernst Haeckel. I'm not thinking right now, but there's quite a few that I had to take out. But I thought these people were really cool, so it was based on my own interest.
I did get a kick too. So a number of times when you were talking about women that were within the field, right? You'd say, well, they were considered amateurs and therefore partially because they're women. And I kind of thought, I bet you for the time period, they were only considered amateurs because they were women. Not so much that they were amateurs and they were discounted as women, but probably just Stuck with that title as amateur only for that reason.
Yeah, in many cases, they actually weren't allowed to get formal education in the way that men did. So there wasn't a way for them to be anything but amateurs. So it was kind of really unfair. Oh, I'm going to answer. Oh, yeah. Jack asked about John Muir laws. I meant to bring up John Muir laws when I mentioned sketching, and I forgot to put that in my notes. John Muir laws, which is not related to John Muir actually at all. He has a website and books that teach you about kind of intro to nature journaling. There's a lot of free resources on his website though, but that's really awesome. And then Anne asked who was the German woman. That was Maria Sibylla Marion. Hopefully I can spell it right. Yeah.
It's being recorded.
Deb asks, is there an inexpensive way to use cyanotypes with kids on a large scale kit? Yeah, so Deb, if you buy the, you can actually buy the, just the chemical fluids for cyanotypes. You don't have to buy sun paper. You can buy the fluids. It's like a 2-pack. You can get it from B&H Photo for like 25 bucks, and it lasts a very long time. So if you just buy the fluids themselves, you can brush the fluid onto any paper of any size and develop your own paper. So yes, absolutely, you can do it very affordably.
Tara,
Yeah.
Ansel Adam used photography. Would that be journaling as well?
For sure, and I didn't include photography, you know, really for time. And I figured, honestly, photography was probably one of the more approachable ways that a lot of people in our group were more familiar with. But wonderful point. Yeah, absolutely. Photography is a great way of journaling.
Thank you.
Yeah, I know how to use a camera.
We all have one on our phones now. You know, it used to be a little bit trickier. There's a couple more questions on the chat, maybe some links that I'll go back and add. Yeah, I'll go back and add some links there.
Other questions?
Questions answered?
Yeah. All right.
I have a question. This was a fabulous presentation. You
Okay.
probably give workshops on journaling. I know a lot of us have taken those. I've never been on one where they actually did the pressed plants, the cyanotype, the hammering. That would be a great and fun class to take. I don't know if you lead them or if you know anybody else that does it, where we do the hands-on, kind of like a combo art class.
Yeah, that's a great
Rather than
idea.
just walking in the woods and sketching on our own, you know, because you've bumped it up so many times from standard journaling. From what I, think of as journaling is mainly sketching and drawing, drawing a couple of plants, and that's it.
That's a great question. I actually don't teach any nature journaling workshops. I do work full time for a nonprofit called Perennial, where we teach DIY classes. So I do some natural dyes classes. We do have a cyanotypes class, but I actually don't teach it. But that's a great point, Sharon. Yeah, I would be interested to do that for sure.
Have you been approached yet for anything like tri-chapter sessions when we're doing the training for that, or for since we've got intern training, that'll come up as a topic here shortly. I see Michael smiling now, so
you're reading my mind, Bob.
No, that'd be great.
This.
Yeah, like I said, I know sketching can be it can be really scary to people. So I think some of those other methods are just so approachable. They're not scary. It doesn't take any talent.
oh, that's perfect for me. No talent. Well, very good. If there's no other questions, oh my God, Tara, thank you so much for doing this. This is amazing.
Yeah, of course. It was exciting for me. I got to read a whole lot, and it was nice to feel like I was back in school.
Wow,
the comfort.
That wasn't a previously well-rehearsed presentation?
Absolutely not. No, all this research I've done probably within the past month and a half.
Wow.
Astounded. Absolutely astounded.
Excellent.
All right, I'm going to stop recording at this point so that people can say whatever else they want to now.